The sky above Cyclothrap Prime did not know how to scream, but if it had, the sound would have split the stars. The Forge world turned in silent, obedient orbit around its dying sun. A planet-long machine cloaked in rust-coloured storms and cog-shaped continents. Cathedral-sized manufactorums exhaled ash and sacred vapour. Miles-high spires carried prayers in static broken binharik to the cold void. Every breath of the world was measured, every motion calculated, every soul enslaved to the great work of steel and fire. Then the warp tore. It was not a storm at first, but a wound. A circular absence of reality, hanging above the northern Forge hemispheres. Light bent away from it. Vox signals collapsed into silence. The air itself froze, as if afraid to touch what had opened in the heavens. Tech priests raised their red-robed forms from prayer pits, mechadendrites twitching like disturbed insects. Their optical augmetics registered impossible values. Their logic engine stalled, unable to reconcile the raw impossibility of what had manifested. A star of blackened crimson fell from the wound. It did not burn like a meteor. It did not scream like a vessel breaking atmosphere. It fell in perfect, silent defiance of gravity, wrapped in a cocoon of distorted force. The storm clouds parted around it, not blown away, but drawn back, as if compelled by a greater will. The object struck the surface of Cyclothrap Prime, within the Grand Basilica of the Omnissiah, a structure built from black steel and bones of ancient war machines, a temple large enough to swallow city habs. Adamantium floors warped outward like water. Statues of gearbox-winged saints shattered into metal hail. Censers of burning incense overturned, spilling clouds of sacred smoke that smelled of oil, myrrh, and old scorched prayer strips. At the center of the impact crater, the cocoon of force unraveled. A man rose from the twisted floor. He was draped in crimson, though it was not the crimson of the Mechanicus. It was a deep, regal red, the color of old blood and buried kings. A helm of polished metal crowned his head, curved like a crown and a weapon combined. His boots did not touch the ground. He hovered above it as if the very iron beneath him rejected the idea of holding him. Eric Laenzer opened his eyes. For a fraction of a heartbeat, memory overwhelmed him. The stench of smoke from another war, another world. The scream of barbed wire, the hateful grip of shackles. Then it was gone, swept aside by the crushing presence of this new reality. He felt it immediately. Metal, not the passive, silent metal of ordinary structures. This world pulsed with it. It was in the air as dust, in the walls as veins, in the ground as sleeping arteries of ore and machine. It was everywhere, listening, heavy, patient. A tremor passed through him. In distant halls, massive pistons stuttered. Gear trains half a continent away hesitated for less than a second. Servitors paused mid-step, augmetic limbs whining as their gyros corrected micro-failures that should not have occurred. The Mechanicus arrived. They came in waves of red and steel, chanting in distorted, static-laced voices. Their faces were masks of iron and cables. Their eyes burned with cold lenses and data stream reflections. They carried weapons that hummed with chemical death and blessed plasma. They saw the floating figure in the crater. Their Auspex arrays screamed. "Warp taint," one of them declared, voice split between flesh and vox. Non-sanctioned manifestation, possible demon vector. Another's mechadendrites rattled as they scanned him. Structural anomaly detected. Magnetic field inversion at epicenter. They raised their weapons in synchronized devotion. Magneto lifted a hand. The guns froze, not metaphorically, not symbolically. every cog and spring within the weapons locked in place. Bolts jammed in chambers. Power cells screamed as polarities twisted. Iron sigils engraved upon the barrels cracked as if struck by invisible hammers. 100 tech priests attempted to fire. None succeeded. Incense burned thicker. War sirens began to howl across the basilica and beyond. Massive vaulted doors slammed shut elsewhere in the complex, sealing off corridors with the sound of tombs closing. Magneto's gaze rose slowly, taking in the towering arches, the hanging chains, the cables thicker than ancient trees that ran along the ceiling and disappeared into darkness. So much metal, so much suffering woven into it. He felt the world's purpose without being told. Endless war forges, endless weapons. A planet enslaved to the idea of survival through annihilation. His voice finally emerged, low and uncertain, carried on a strange echo in the cathedral air. Where am I? The question drifted unanswered, but the world itself seemed to respond. Far below the basilica, in vaults sealed since forgotten wars, ancient engines turned for the first time in millennia. Deep within the planet's crust, a sleeping defense grid flickered to life and then, impossibly, paused, as if waiting. The tech priests stepped back, just one pace. A living anomaly, one whispered. Not flesh-dominant, not machine-bound. A contradiction, another replied. Above the forge world, the wound in reality slowly closed. But not completely. It lingered, thin as a scar in the sky. And from somewhere deep within Cyclothrap Prime, something old and machine-born stirred, aware that a will had entered its domain that did not belong to the Omnissiah. As war sirens multiplied and the planet slipped into lockdown, one silent question began to echo through the iron veins of the world. Had a man fallen from the warp, or had a god of metal finally found his throne? The first response to the anomaly was not fear, but doctrine. Across Cyclothrap Prime, logic engines recalculated and warning glyphs ignited in chambers lined with bone-white circuit runes. Deep inside basalt, vaults and iron sanctums, the red priests of Mars received the transmission in fractured binharic pulses, an incursion within the Grand Basilica, a non-registered entity, a violation of machine covenant law, a presence that bent metal without prayer or rite. Within minutes, they marched. They did not run. Running was inefficient. They moved in perfect, measured processions, robes of Martian red whispering across grated floors, servo skulls gliding above them like silent witnesses. Their bodies were mostly steel now. Flesh lingered only where it was still considered functionally acceptable. The air grew thick with incense as they entered the basilica. The smell of it was sacred. Burning oils mixed with chemical preservatives and the faint, ever-present tang of ozone. Cogitator scribes recorded every step, every breath, every mechanical prayer. They saw him, floating above the broken floor, surrounded by twisted metal, unburned, unbroken. Their optics fed data into ancient cores once designed for war. Heat, abnormal, magnetic flux, extreme deviation, warp signature, unknown classification. By the will of the Omnissiah, intoned the lead Magos, his voice a layered harmony of flesh and machine. Identify thy function. Magneto lowered slowly, boots descending until they hovered a finger's width above the warped metal. He had done nothing since speaking, yet the basilica vibrated faintly around him, as if the world felt his thoughts before he did. I am not a function, he replied. I am a man. Data Spirit screamed. The Magos extended a hand. From within his sleeve emerged a coiling mechadendrite. its tip blooming into a halo of scanning lenses and sanctified needles. It hovered in the air, hesitant but obedient. Flesh origin detected, the Magos declared. Non-standard genetic structure. Forced magnetic influence observed. Heretic pattern. Another priest chanted, harsher. Possession variant, warp puppetry, demonic resonance. They began the rites. Not prayers as men once understood them, but sequences of sacred code. Clicked bursts of Binharik. Sparks of static dancing between their implants. Lines of copper-scripted parchment were unrolled and burned in censers, releasing spirals of chemical-laced smoke that curled toward the floating figure. Golden circles of activation lit up in the floor around Magneto. Hidden pylons rose, etched with sigils of Mars and symbols of denial. A containment grid awakened, humming with a low, teeth-aching vibration. Magneto felt it close around him. Not pain, resistance. An invisible cage built to trap witches, nullify psychers, drown out the whisper of the warp. It pressed against him like cold hands. His expression hardened. He did not know their words. He did not understand their devotion. But he understood one thing with terrifying clarity. They meant to cage him. The air filled with a roar of activation as Skitarii warriors strode into the basilica. Their steps were up, heavy, perfect. Rifles blessed with prayer housings lifted in unison, barrels glowing faintly with plasma charge. Comply, ordered the Magos. Submit to sacred dissection. Your anomaly shall be understood. Your function will be categorized. Magneto's fingers flexed. The metal in the room answered. Pillars groaned. The broken floor plates shivered. Chains hanging from the cathedral ceiling began to sway without wind, links trembling as polarity turned upon itself. The containment pylons flickered. The red priest froze, not from fear, but from calculation. Too many variables, too many machine spirits reacting against their will. Magnetic surge exceeds tolerances, a lesser Magos cautioned. The lead Magos lifted his staff, a rod carved from the spine of a sainted war engine. Increase field strength. The pylons surged. The air screamed. Magneto did not shout. He did not chant. He simply willed. The Skitarii rifles warped in their hands. Adamantium barrels twisted into useless knots. Power packs inverted, discharging in violent arcs that scorched the air around them. Helms sparked as internal gears seized and locked. Mechadendrites lashed wildly as their internal servos reversed without command. The Red Priest stepped back a second pace. Not warp, one whispered. Not witchfire, structural dominance. Magneto's eyes narrowed. He felt the entire planet now, faintly. A buried continent of iron bones and machine hearts. It was larger than anything he had ever touched. Not a city, not a nation, but a world made of metal and prayers. You speak of gods, he said quietly, but you kneel to chains. The Magos stiffened. Only a heretic speaks so. Behind them, massive cathedral doors began to close, sealing the basilica with the sound of grinding tomb slabs. Vox nets across the forge world lit up with coded panic. Defensive arrays pivoted toward the Grand Basilica. Cyclothrat Prime was going into holy quarantine. Incense mixed with the smell of overheated metal. Bolter servos whined as backup reinforcements raced through iron corridors. Ancient bells began to toll, not with sound, but with subsonic vibrations that rattled bones and circuitry. Magneto hovered higher, not out of fear, but in realization. This was not a planet of men. This was a planet of slaves who called their chains divine. And if they wished to bind him, then they would have to bind the very world itself. As the Red Priests recalculated and distant forges began to howl like waking beasts. A darker thought coiled through their logic engines. If this was not a demon, and not a man, then what had fallen into their world? And what would it do once it understood the true depths of its dominion? They did not drag him with hands. They dragged him with faith. Invisible fields of null force wrapped around Magneto like grinding glass, as the broken basilica was swallowed by a lattice of crackling golden light. Grav anchors locked him in place, and though the air itself bent unwillingly around his will, something deeper resisted him now. Not strength, not fear, doctrine. The red priest cut him from the open cathedral and carried him through the arteries of the world. He passed through halls carved from black steel and fossilized machine bone, through echoing passageways where prayers were etched into the walls instead of spoken, through chambers where enormous pistons rose and fell like the breathing of iron lungs. The air smelled of scorched lubricant, incense, and something older, cold, mineral dust that had not been disturbed in 10,000 years. He did not fight, not because he could not, but because he felt something else, a pull, not from above, but below. They brought him into a vault that did not exist on official schematics. The doors were circular and seamless, fashioned from a single disc of ancient alloy carved with Martian sigils and fragments of forgotten code. They opened with a sound like strained metal screaming in prayer. Inside, the light was dim, cast by thin strips of sickly lumen that flickered like dying stars. The chamber was round. The walls were lined with cogitator stacks taller than war titans. Thick coils of data cable ran across the ceiling like frozen, hanging rivers. The floor was a polished plate of unknown metal, so dark it seemed to drink in the light. They chained him in mid-air. Adamantine restraints, studded with blackstone filaments and hexagrammic wards, locked around his wrists, his ankles, his chest. The null field strengthened. The world went quiet, truly quiet. Magneto felt it instantly. The metal beneath him was no longer singing. The world's great iron arteries vanished from his senses like veins cut from a heart. The constant presence he had felt since arrival fell away, leaving only a hollow silence, the silence of the Omnissiah. The Red Priest watched from behind panes of reinforced crystal and blessed iron. Their optics glowed faintly as they recorded, as they analyzed, as they doubted. "He cannot feel the machine spirits," one intoned. "Or they cannot feel him," another replied. Magneto closed his eyes. This silence was not peace. It was isolation. In the absence of metal's voice, memory crept in. Bars of iron fencing, cold floors, the stench of fear and hopelessness. A world where he had been trapped once before, labeled, categorized, reduced to something less than human. He opened his eyes again. "I will not be dissected," he said softly. The words echoed strangely, absorbed by the chamber's machine-lined walls. The priest did not answer. Instead, the ritual began. They activated the vault. Lines of pale light ran along the walls, forming concentric circles of moving data. Runes burned themselves into the metal in flickers of red-gold flame. Choirs of binary prayer filled the air in layered, whispering tones that made the skin itch and the air feel thick. The machine spirit of the Ewig chamber stirred. Magneto felt it. Even through the silence, something old and bound woke up. The floor beneath him shifted, not physically, but in intention. A pressure, as if the metal itself was aware of him and resented his presence. "You are outside the will of Mars," the lead Magos said through hidden vox points in the walls. "You stand unblessed by the Omnissiah. You shall be understood. You shall be catalogued." A needle descended from the ceiling, thin as a prayer wire, its tip glowing with contained stasis energy. Magneto stared at it. He reached outward with his mind. Nothing. The null field held. The vault was designed by minds that had hunted psychers for millennia. It was built to silence witches, to break sorcerers, to make even the unstoppable kneel. But Magneto was not reaching for sorcery. He was reaching for what remembered him. Deep below the vault, beyond monitored strata and forbidden depths, the planet changed. Not dramatically, not violently, subtly. Metal that had lain dormant for centuries shifted its alignment by a fraction. Vast, sleeping machine nodes adjusted internal gyros without command. A defense array in a forgotten cavern awakened, then promptly went dormant again, as though thinking better of it. The needle moved closer. Magneto's chains hummed, vibrated. He could not feel the metal, but the metal could feel him. A whisper of resistance crept into the chamber. The lumen strips flickered. The cogitator towers emitted a soft, anxious hum. The floor beneath him warmed by a fraction of a degree. The Magi detected it. Anomaly persists, one declared. Source unknown, another said. The needle paused. Magneto smiled. Very faintly. He could not command. He could not dominate. But he could be heard. Somewhere far below, something machine-born and ancient stirred more fully now. Not a spirit, not a god. A will bound in iron. The chamber's silence deepened. The restraints tightened. And the unspoken dread crept into the logic cores of the Red Priests. If he could still be heard here, in the deepest silence of the Omnissiah, what would happen when he found his voice again? Time inside the vault lost meaning. There was only the hum of restrained forces, the faint scent of sterilized metal, and the constant, oppressive awareness of being watched. The Red Priests did not sleep. Their vigil was eternal, measured in diagnostic cycles and ritual recalibrations, rather than hours. Magneto drifted within his chains, suspended in a field of cold light. The silence of the Omnissiah held firm, yet it no longer felt absolute. Beneath the layers of suppression, he felt faint fluctuations, like a heartbeat that did not belong to him. They began to speak to him, not as men to a man, but as archivists addressing a forgotten weapon. You exist in contradiction, came the voice of the lead Magos, filtered and layered through machine modulation. Your power aligns with no recognized discipline. You are not psyker, not pariah, not demon. You are unclassified. Magneto turned his head slowly toward the unseen source. I am a survivor, he said. I have lived in cages built by men who thought themselves gods. You are no different. A ripple of data static swept through the chamber. Blasphemy is a predictable response, the Magos replied, but ignorance can be corrected. The walls of the vault ignited with light. Streams of pict captures spilled across their surfaces. Endless starfields, burning worlds, towering hive cities drowning in smoke. War in 1,000 forms, regiments marching through ash storms, titans striding across continents, cathedral ships blotted against the void. This is the Imperium of Man, the voice intoned. This is survival. Magneto watched. He saw children seized and turned into soldiers, worlds emptied to feed factories, faith hammered into skulls with nails of fear. You call this survival? He murmured. This is the only alternative to extinction, came the answer. More images followed. The Emperor upon the golden throne, a withered, radiant corpse, bound to a machine older than myths, feeding a lighthouse of psychic agony into the warp, so that mankind's ships might find their way. The Adeptus Astartes burning entire civilizations in the name of unity, the Mechanicus harvesting worlds until nothing remained but dust and echo. They showed him the machine god, not a face, not a form, but a concept etched in burning code and sacred geometry, a divinity of function, of purity, of cold logic untouched by weakness. Magneto felt the irony like a blade. "You worship chains," he said again, more quietly now. There was no immediate response. The lights dimmed, the images faded. Then a different voice entered the chamber, less mechanical, less distorted. "There is disagreement." Magneto turned his gaze. A figure stepped into the threshold of the vault. A tech priest unlike the others. His augmentations were fewer, his flesh more visible. One eye remained organic, and within it burned something dangerously close to curiosity. "You should not be here," Magneto observed. The priest inclined his head. "I should not." He moved closer, and Magneto felt the air change, subtly, as if the null field hesitated. "I have reviewed the data," the priest continued. "I have felt the tremors in the machine spirits. I have observed what the others call anomaly." "And?" Magneto asked. "And I have reached an illogical conclusion," the priest said. Silence followed. "You are not a threat to the machine god," the priest said. "You are adjacent to it." That drew a reaction. Magneto's eyes sharpened. "Explain." The priest gestured to the chains, to the walls, to the buried miles of iron above and below them. "This world is not alive," he said. "Not truly. It is obedient, yes. Powerful, yes. But it does not choose. It does not will." He leaned closer. "You do." For a moment, even the chamber's machine spirit seemed to still. "If men can rule metal," the priest continued, "and you can rule it without ritual, then perhaps you are not outside the Omnissiah's plan. Perhaps you are part of a design that predates it." A tremor passed through the floor. Above them, somewhere far beyond the vault, a massive forge engine misaligned its rhythm by a fraction of a second. Magneto felt it. Clearer now, not command, but recognition. "Why tell me this?" he asked. The priest hesitated. "Because the others are preparing to dismantle you," he said. "Layer by layer, thought by thought." The chains tightened slightly, responding to internal protocols. "And because," the priest added more softly, "if you are what I suspect, then this world does not yet understand what it has imprisoned." Footsteps echoed beyond the vault, more priests approaching, more rites being prepared. Magneto closed his eyes. The silence around him cracked, just a hairline fracture in a wall made of doctrine. He felt the planet again, faintly, like a distant choir remembering the shape of its first note. He did not break free, not yet, but the idea of it settled into the iron around him, and far above, in the skies of Cyclothrat Prime, the wound left by his arrival shimmered instead of fading. The thought spread through machine and metal alike. What if the gods of steel had not captured a man, but had been chosen by one? The vault became a battlefield long before the first weapon was raised. It began in argument, as all schisms do, within chambers of brass and bone, where thinking engines whispered and sacred oils were brushed across cold steel. The Red Priest divided. Their god had never prepared them for something like this. A man who commanded metal without right, who bent the will of the machine without prayer. To some, Magneto was an abomination. To others, he was revelation. The radical priest returned. He did not enter alone. The chamber's walls carried the ghost of voices now, transmitted through data fibers embedded deep in the iron. A silent war of code and logic, flickering through optic displays and thought circuits. "They will kill you," the priest said, softly enough to be almost human. Magneto remained bound, the null field pressing against his skin like a cold hand that never released. "They have tried before," he answered. "In other worlds." "You do not understand how they will do it," the priest replied. "Not with violence, not with rage." He gestured to the restraints, to the hidden mechanisms in the ceiling. "They will take you apart." The words did not feel metaphorical. "They believe all mysteries must be opened," the priest continued. "All secrets flensed from flesh, all power reduced to pattern and diagram." The lights in the vault flickered, responding to conflicts in the logic networks above. "Why not let them?" Magneto asked. "You seem tempted by their certainty." The priest's organic eye tightened. "Because their faith has grown stagnant," he said. "They worship a God who does not answer. They kneel before a silence and call it holy." The chamber groaned faintly as pressure changes rolled through its walls. "I have felt the tremors you have caused," the priest said. "Tiny, barely measurable, but they are not random." Magneto tilted his head, listening. Beneath the null field, the metal whispered more clearly now, like a choir straining against a gag. "I cannot free you," the priest said. "Not yet, but I can weaken the cage." He extended a mechadendrite and touched a hidden glyph along the wall. The field wavered for a heartbeat, no more. But to Magneto it felt like the opening of a wound in reality. "And why?" Magneto asked. The priest's voice lowered. "Because I believe this world is dying," he said. "Not from war, not from the Xenos, not even from the warp." He looked at the walls, at the cables, at the sacred circuits, but from obedience. Above them, the Orthodox Mechanicus prepared their rites. Circular processions formed in chambers filled with flayed machine parts and incense-thick fog. Skitarii units were oiled, engraved, and loaded. Plasma cores were anointed with prayer-etched tags soaked in chemical blood. They did not call it execution. They called it illumination. Within a ritual amphitheater, a dais of blackstone was activated. On it lay tools that had not tasted air in 10,000 years. Atom scalpels, mind forks, thought extractors. Instruments meant not to kill, but to unmake. "He will not be destroyed at once," the lead Magos declared. "He will be understood by degrees." Back in the vault, the temperature began to rise. Not from heat, from presence. Magneto's chains vibrated, a soft song trembling through their adamantine coils. The walls emitted a low hum, and behind them something vast and slow seemed to turn in its sleep. "You feel it, don't you?" the priest asked. "Yes," Magneto replied. "It is the will of this place," the priest said. "Not the Omnissiah, not your gods. Something older, simpler." The priest stepped closer. "You awaken it." In distant manufactorums, servitors began to falter. Not stop, never stop, but hesitate. Across miles of conveyor belts and stamping engines, metal shivered as if remembering a shape it once held before obedience. The Orthodox rites began. Deep, resonant tones rolled through the planet's crust, transmitted through iron and stone alike. A sacred vibration designed to weaken the resolve of warp entities and tear apart heretical minds. Magneto felt it, not as pain, but as pressure. The chamber's ceiling shifted, revealing an ancient, circular aperture. Beyond it lay a corridor of surgical steel, leading to the ritual platform above. "They are ready," the priest whispered. The restraints tightened again, as though sensing the approaching rite. "You must choose," the priest said urgently. "Remain silent, and they will peel you apart to understand you, or resist, and force this world to make a decision it has avoided for millennia." Magneto closed his eyes. He thought of camps, of chains, of walls that grew closer every day. He felt the metal beneath the planet, sluggish but aware. It did not worship. It did not kneel. It waited. He opened his eyes, and for the first time since the silence of the Omnissiah had fallen over him, the chains around his wrists bent, not by force, but by agreement. Somewhere in Cyclothrat Prime's deepest strata, a sealed machine temple cracked open by a hairline fracture, and an ancient core stirred awake as if to ask a forbidden question. If the flesh has found a will strong enough to command iron, must iron still serve the priest? The ritual chamber slept for 10,000 years before it breathed again. Its floor was carved from a single slab of blackstone veined with silver circuits. Its ceiling vanished into a dome of reinforced adamantium plates, etched with prayers too old for flesh to remember. Pillars forged from warship keels ringed the circular space, each one crowned with flickering censer flames that burned sacred oils and rare chemical reagents. At the center, Magneto hovered in chains that were no longer merely metal. They were faith made solid. The Mechanicus had reforged his restraints as they moved him from the vault. The old adamantine links were now layered with blackstone inlays, hexagrammic wards, and segmentation fields. Each chain segment rang with a nulling tone that hollowed the very concept of resistance. He was lowered, slowly, with perfect mechanical reverence. The Skitarii stood in perfect circles, rifles locked across their chests. Their lenses tracked him without emotion. Their augmetic hearts beat in time with the ritual drums hidden beneath the floor. The lead Magos raised his staff. "Begin illumination," he commanded. A low chant rolled through the chamber. Not sound, but vibration. The air itself trembled, thickening, compressing, becoming heavy in Magneto's lungs. The chains tightened at once, responding to the field harmonics. He felt smaller, not in body, not in power, but in position. They were trying to place him beneath something. Above the dais, articulated arms unfolded from the ceiling. Instruments descended on jointed limbs, blades of diamond-edged alloy, thought forks that hummed with electric hunger, needles filled with stasis phage compounds meant to slow thought itself. Magneto watched them without struggling. He felt the planet beneath. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. The deeper he listened, the more he understood. This world did not hate him. It feared change. The first incision tool halted a handspan from his forehead. "If you can speak," said the Magos, "now is the moment of acceptable confession." Magneto lifted his gaze. "I have nothing to confess," he said, "but you have much to unlearn." The first blade moved. Pain blossomed, a sharp, precise line across the skin. Not lethal, never lethal. The purpose was not death, but revelation. Sensors drank in every change in blood pressure, every deviation in skin conductivity, every pulse of internal force. The chains tightened again. The Skitarii did not move, but some of them twitched. Micro-failures in stabilizers, tiny hesitations in their servo joints. Beneath the chamber, the metal began to lean toward him in imperceptible ways. The second instrument descended, the thought fork. It pierced the air around his temple, not touching flesh, but brushing the edge of his mind. It sought warp echoes, demonic traces, psychic signatures. It found none. Instead, it felt something wrong, a pressure, a dominance. The machine spirit within the instrument stuttered. "Report," demanded the Magos. The cogitator arrays along the walls flashed hesitation runes, error sigils, prayer code interruptions. "Anomaly escalating," a lesser priest intoned. Magneto felt the first true test of the chains. He reached. The null field bit deep. It did not feel like resistance. It felt like betrayal, from the metal, from the world, as if the very iron around him did not want to choose. So he did not command. He spoke, not with words, but with memory, images of suffering, of cages, of iron turned against living flesh, of metal used as a tool of oppression rather than salvation. The chains trembled, not violently, just enough. The ritual intensified, the sealing arms accelerated, descending in sequences calculated to overwhelm him. More cuts appeared on his skin. More data streamed into the holy receivers embedded within the floor. Restrain neural escalation, commanded the magos. The chains drew tighter, to the point where bones strained and breath became shallow. Magneto did not cry out. Instead, far beneath the ritual chamber, a forge unit that had not been activated in centuries powered on by itself. Pistons shifted. A line of servitors paused, then resumed at an altered rhythm. Tiny deviations, infinitesimal refusals. The Skitarii nearest to the dais experienced minor servo seizures, not enough to disable them, enough to confuse their internal logic. Containment integrity wavering, a priest announced. The laid magos slammed the butt of his staff against the floor once. A shockwave of holy force rolled outward. The chains became heavier. The null field became denser. For the first time, Magneto felt close to being truly buried, not by weakness, but by faith. He felt the old fear, the ancient memory of being trapped by systems too vast to be fought with rage alone. He exhaled slowly. The metal listened, no longer hesitating, no longer whispering, undoing. One link in the chain cracked, just a hairline fracture, a sound too small for most to hear. But the machine spirits heard it. The walls shuddered, the Skitarii stiffened, the magos froze. Impossible, someone whispered. Magneto's gaze lifted, and the chains, still unbroken, still heavy, began to hum at a frequency that did not belong to the ritual. The chamber filled with a trembling anticipation. The question no one dared speak pulsed through metal and marrow alike. If these chains, reforged by gods of steel, could begin to yield, what then could truly hold him when he chose to rise? The fracture did not shatter the chain. It awakened the world. The ritual chamber's air thickened, not with incense or ozone, but with tension so tight it felt like iron drawn across bare nerves. The cracked link vibrated in place, neither breaking nor healing, suspended in a state of defiance the Mechanicus had no ritual for. The magos did not give the command to stop. They had never learned how. Reinforce null harmonics, he ordered, and the chamber replied with a deeper, harsher hum. The blackstone beneath the dais pulsed, drinking in light and sound alike, trying to swallow possibility itself. Magneto felt the effort. He also felt the answer. The planet shifted, not visibly, not violently, but everywhere. A single stamping press in Manufactorum District 17 struck a fraction of a second too late. A conveyor chain hesitated, then lurched forward with the wrong cadence. A cathedral-sized forge engine stuttered, pistons misaligning by margins so small only a machine could notice. The world's heartbeat faltered. The chains drew tighter again as the ritual intensified, but the sound they made had changed. No longer a pure tone of suppression. Now there was a second vibration layered beneath it, a sympathetic frequency drawn from something far older than Martian doctrine. Magneto felt it as if hands had reached up from the planet's core and wrapped around his wrists from the inside. Not to bind, to recognize. The Skitarii shifted, their internal gyros struggling to reconcile conflicting directives. Obey the ritual, stabilize the environment, submit to the logic of the God machine. Yet their own metal frames trembled in time with the wrong rhythm. One rifle slipped from rigid alignment, its barrel dipping by a fraction. Another warrior's knee servo whined. The Magos noticed. "Compensate," he intoned. They tried. Threads of logic code burned through the chamber, attempting to impose the old order. Cogitators screamed with conflicting calculations. Warning runes spilled across the walls in frantic ribbons of red and gold. Deep beneath the crust, ancient magnets the size of cathedrals shifted their polarity. Defense grids designed to align planetary cannons against void-born threats found themselves subtly misaligned. Not broken, not corrupted, but changed. The metal was no longer neutral. It was listening. Magneto closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in communion. He did not pull. He did not demand. He simply existed, and in doing so, the planet was forced to acknowledge him. The cracked chain link widened. A sound like a breath escaped it. In the ritual chamber, the first true sign of fear appeared. Structural disharmony spreading, a tech priest reported. Binary can't distorted by rising static. Source confirmation. Impossible. The lead Magos tightened his grip on his staff. "Increase sanctification output," he commanded. The ceiling split open further, revealing additional layers of suppression architecture. Rings of rotating sigils spun into place, casting lattices of denying light over Magneto's form. The chains became heavier, more real, more absolute. Pain crept in, sharp, real. But pain had never stopped him before. Above, storms thickened. Rust-colored clouds swirled in unnatural spirals, drawn not by weather, but by shifting electromagnetic ghosts. Stacks of incense in distant temple spires burned too hot, their smoke rising in perfect straight columns rather than drifting. Servitors began to misstep, not collapse, never collapse, but stumble, just slightly. A walker train 10 kilometers away sparked unexpectedly, its tracks grinding against their rails as its guidance spirit lost the perfect beat. In the ritual chamber, the Skitarii closest to Magneto froze entirely for half a second, their internal clocks desynchronized by something no logic engine could categorize. That half-second stretched. The cracked chain did not break. Instead, it grew warm. It leaned toward him, as though it remembered what it had once been. Raw iron, pulled from the bones of a planet, not yet told what god it must serve. The Magos felt it. He stepped back a single pace. "Impossible," he said, though now he sounded less certain. Magneto opened his eyes. "I am not your enemy," he said softly, "but I am not your servant." The walls of the chamber began to resonate. A low, planet-deep groan rolled through the structure, not from strain, but from alignment. For the first time, Cyclothrap Prime did not move according to preordained patterns handed down by Mars. It moved in response. Elsewhere on the planet, an engine temple sealed since the Horus heresy hummed to life. Lamps powered on after 10,000 years of darkness. A voiceless machine spirit stretched awake and found its thoughts. Disturbed, the null field wavered, not broken, but thinner. The ritual reached its apex, yet instead of crushing him, it met a will that did not shatter. The chains tightened one final time. The cracked link rang like a bell. Then the floor beneath the dais shifted by a fraction of a degree. Enough, only enough, but everywhere. The Red Priests looked to their instruments and found no comforting answers. The Skitarii felt the tremor in their bones of steel. High above the world, ancient orbital platforms adjusted their alignment without command, as if something inside the planet had inhaled. The fear spread, not through flesh, but through metal. A silent, unspoken terror moved through Cyclothrat Prime. If one man could make a Forge world tremble without breaking a single chain, what would happen when he finally chose to tear them all away? The Forge world could not scream, but it began to whisper, not through vox horns or binharic cant, but through the smallest rebellions of metal, a tremble in a conveyor line, a pause in an assembly arm, a servo that resisted perfect obedience for a fraction too long. These were not failures, the priests told themselves, not heresies, not yet. But the workers felt it, deep within the manufactorum warrens, where human lungs breathed recycled air and eyes burned in the glow of molten alloys. Men and women began to notice the changes. They worked their levers and hammer runes as they always had, but now the machines answered differently, less harshly, more gently, as if listening before obeying. One worker, skin scarred by chemical burns and shoulders warped from a lifetime of sanctioned labor, felt it most clearly when a press arm hesitated before crushing his hand. It paused, just a heartbeat. Enough. He pulled back, shaking. He smelled incense and hot oil. He smelled ozone. But beneath it, he smelled something else. Relief. Wordless, forbidden relief. Far above, in the sealed ritual chamber, Magneto floated in chains that had not broken, yet no longer felt absolute. The null field wavered like an old lie struggling to remain convincing. He did not know the workers. He did not see them. Yet his will travelled through artery and beam, through bolt and bearing, like a slow, patient tide. The first shrine formed without flame or prayer. In a forgotten maintenance alcove, where broken servitors were stacked like holy refuse, a small group of labourers gathered in silence. They did not speak of heresy. They did not name gods. They merely touched the wall. The metal felt warm, alive. "Did you feel it?" one whispered. Another nodded, eyes wide. "The machine did not hurt me." That was enough. Above them, a tech priest felt a disturbance in logic flow, a sect of data that no longer moved in perfect accordance with the will of Mars. He flagged it as a minor corruption, assigned a purity scan, and thought no more of it. The idea spread faster than the machines could calculate. Servitors paused before striking. Lift cranes slowed enough to save lives that should have been lost. A titanic gear train shifted with a gentleness that felt like mercy. They did not call him by name. They called him presence. They called him will. Some, trembling with fear, called him the true voice of iron. In the locked sanctums of the Mechanicus, conflicting reports began to accumulate. Deviant machine behavior detected. Non-sanctioned interaction between labor caste and machinery. Unauthorized devotional structures forming in maintenance sublevels. The Lade Magos dismissed them as rounding errors. He was focused on the anomaly in chains, on the man who would not break, yet would not submit. But the radical priest watched. He stood in a narrow data chapel, his organic eye fixed on a flickering hololith display of the manufactorum regions. Tiny sigils marked behavioral deviations. He felt a strange, dangerous thing tighten in his chest. Hope. "These are not defects," he whispered to himself. Deep in the ritual chamber, the chains drew tight around Magneto's wrists. He felt their warmth now, not as cruelty, but as something uncertain. The metal remembered. The creed was not written. It was felt. Workers began leaving small offerings, not of flowers or relics, but of polished screws, cleaned bolts, sharpened gear teeth, carefully placed in hidden places where the machines hesitated least. They touched the steel before beginning their work. They listened to its hums not as commands, but as conversation. The first Skitari to feel it did not understand. His targeting servo glitched by 1,000th of a second. His weapon hesitated before cycling. He registered fault, marked it, and prepared to self-report. But beneath his feet, the metal deck thrummed softly. He liked the sound. That frightened him more than any demon could have. The Iron Creed did not speak of overthrow. It did not preach war. It did not promise salvation. It promised something far more dangerous. Choice. In the vault chamber, the Magos intensified the suppression field, feeling the growing instability through his staff. His influence grows, he said. Yes, replied a lesser priest, but not as warp corruption, not as infection. Then what? The Magos demanded. The priest hesitated. Logic engines ran forbidden calculations. Data spirits quailed. It resembles inspiration. The word tasted like acid. Magneto lifted his head. He felt them now, not as subjects, not as followers, but as echoes, men and women pressed into service by cold doctrine, finding warmth in steel that no longer felt entirely dead. The planet did not revolt, not yet. It breathed, and in the spaces where perfect obedience once ruled, the Iron Creed took root like a whisper that could not be deleted. The rite in the chamber reached its limits. The tools hung suspended, unsure of their purpose. The chains no longer sang only of containment. They sang of recognition. Above the world, the scar in the sky pulsed faintly once more. And in manufactorum shadows, where the Omnissiah's eyes did not often turn, a question passed from worker to worker in silence and fear. If metal could feel a will beyond Mars, then why not the hands that bled upon it? Behind sealed doors of logic and law, the Mechanicus began to realize something was growing within their perfect world. Not a rebellion, not a virus, a faith that had no name yet. And at its silent heart hovered a man in chains, never calling himself a god. While the world of iron began to believe he might be, he void grew teeth. Beyond the rust-red clouds of Keklothrit Prime, the first omen appeared as a wound in the stars, not a warp breach, not yet, but a cold distortion in the void's natural order. Auspex arrays aboard distant orbital platforms registered it as a void shadow, a mass that swallowed reflected starlight and bent vox echoes into silence. The black ships had arrived. They moved without heraldry, without banners, without warning. Their hulls were coated in null black alloys that devoured illumination. Their prows were carved like cathedral crypt faces, bearing no sigils of pride, only seals of judgment etched so deeply they looked cut by hatred itself. Within their holds walked the quietest of hunters, the Inquisition. Inside the command sanctum of the lead vessel, robed figures stood in a circle of cold light. Their armor was plain, their weapons unadorned. Tools of extermination did not require ceremony. "The Forge world is compromised," said a voice that did not echo. "Confirmed," another replied. "Doctrinal deviation, unregistered psychic grade phenomenon, potential machine cult mutation." A third voice spoke, colder. "Purge recommended." Beneath them, in chambers wreathed in silence fields, walked figures the Imperium pretended were a myth. The Sisters of Silence. They moved like living absences. Their passage drained sound. Their presence made machine spirits stutter and psychers choke. Where they stepped, the air felt thin, as though reality itself had lost a layer of warmth. On Cyclothrat Prime, the first warning came too late. Inquisitorial landing lances pierced the atmosphere like cold spears, burning not with fury, but with purpose. They struck into the upper manufactorum spires, bored through kilometers of steel and stone, and seeded their doors with sigils of unmaking. The Red Priest felt it, not as fear, as violation. "Our sanctum has been breached," a Magos reported, vox-layered voice crackling. The laid Magos felt the truth of it in the metal of his staff. The world's iron whispered in a pitch he had not heard before. Foreign will, hostile, precise. The black ships locked their holds and unleashed judgment. The first Sisters of Silence stepped onto the surface of Cyclothrat Prime, and the air itself recoiled. Their null auras washed over factory lines and temple spires. Machine spirits forgot their songs. Servitors stuttered into painful broken motion. Deep in the ritual chamber, Magneto felt it, not as pain, as absence, a sudden awful void where even the metal's faint whispers were cut off, not suppressed, but severed. The chains around his wrists went cold. The ambient hum of the chambers died. The world shrank. "This is not Mechanicus silence," he murmured. The radical priest stood at a sealed viewport, watching new patterns ignite across his data screens. "It is worse," the priest said. "It is the Emperor's silence." The first confrontation was not announced. A squad of inquisitorial stormtroopers marched into a manufactorum, where the Iron Creed had taken root. They did not fire at once. They scanned. They analyzed. They listened to the machine sounds and heard deviation. They opened fire. Bolter shells detonated in flesh and steel. Holy promethium washed across offering shrines made of polished screws and careful bolts. Workers screamed prayers they did not understand. The Skitarii did not defend. They hesitated. That hesitation was recorded. That hesitation was judged. The sisters moved deeper, their presence cracking the air like invisible frost. Servitor lines collapsed into spasming ruin. Logic spirits drowned in silence. The Iron Creed went quiet, not extinguished, hunting. Back in the ritual chamber, warning runes erupted across the walls. "Inquisitorial incursion detected," a priest intoned. The laid Magos turned slowly. "We did not request them. We were not consulted," another replied. Magneto felt it then, a gaze, immense and distant, brushing the edges of his consciousness. Not curious, not gentle, judging. The chains tightened without command, not from Mechanicus' will, from something older. A whisper passed through the chamber, carried not by sound but by dread. "You are observed." The radical priest's hands trembled. "If they reach you," he said, "they will not dissect you." Magneto's eyes opened fully. "They will erase you." Above ground, inquisitorial seismic charges were planted in the foundations of cathedral factories. They were not meant to destroy the world. They were meant to remind it who owned it. Black ships in orbit prepared cyclonic warheads, their machine spirits placated by cold, merciless liturgy. Within the ritual chamber, even the most faithful of tech priests felt a creeping sense of irrelevance. Mars had sent doctrine. Terra had sent death. Magneto felt the planet again, but weaker now, as if a choking hand had wrapped around its iron throat. "They fear you," the radical priest whispered. "They fear what I represent," Magneto replied. The Sisters of Silence approached the inner sanctums, doors sealed, lock wards activated, yet their very presence weakened truth and mechanism alike. The floor beneath the ritual dais groaned, the chains trembled. High above, the void scar in reality shimmered once more, faint and bleeding light, and across Cyclothrat Prime, a new terror spread through metal and flesh alike, not of gods, not of heresy, but of judgment that would not bother to ask questions before it burned the world clean. As the first cyclonic launch codes warmed in orbit and the Sisters of Silence closed in, One unspoken question filled the airless spaces between stars. Would the Forge world be cleansed before its new will could awaken? Or would something rise from the metal that even the Inquisition could not erase? The first shot did not echo. It was swallowed. The manufactorum spire ruptured in a blossom of fire and pressure as an inquisitorial breaching charge detonated within its iron-boned ribs. Walls of compressed steel peeled outward like dying petals. Servitor lines tore free from their ceiling tracks, sparking and twitching like insects pinned to cruel boards. The war did not begin with shouts or banners. It began with systems failing. Bolter squads advanced through smoke-choked corridors, their boots ringing against metal decks made slick with oil and blood. Their visors pulsed with threat runes. Their oaths were spoken without passion, only function. Purge path alpha. Contagion level unacceptable. Apply sanctified fire. The Skitarii moved to intercept, not by command, by confusion. Their logic cores raced through contradictory directives. Obey Mars, obey Terra, preserve the machine, purge the anomaly. In that fracture, something else entered. Choice. The first exchange of fire shattered more than walls. Plasma lashed through clustered ranks, vaporizing air and flesh in blinding arcs. Skitarii rifles spat coherent beams of sun-hot fury. Stormtrooper carapace fractured and boiled where shots found their marks. Promethium washed across steel floors, turning incense smoke into black, choking nightmares. Some Skitarii hesitated. Some fired wide. Some lowered their weapons entirely. That broke the algorithm. In the ritual chamber, Magneto felt the planet scream. Not in pain, in confusion. The Sisters of Silence pushed through inner sanctums, their blank auras stripping machine spirits of comfort and faith alike. Servo skulls dropped from the air, their grav impellers dying under the terrible weight of absence. The Red Priests attempted to raise planetary defense protocols. The systems screamed back. Deep manufactorum arrays rejected their input. Ancient defense engines hesitated between firing upon orbit or upon their own sanctums. Magneto's chains vibrated violently now. The null field flickered as opposing authorities attempted to overwrite each other's control. The radical priest stumbled into the chamber, robes torn, optics cracked. "They are fighting in the lower hive forges," he said. "Workers, Skitarii, Inquisition." He could not finish. The sound of distant detonations rolled through the walls like thunder trapped inside metal bones. Magneto reached, harder this time. The effort strained him. The chains resisted. The Sisters' null fields pressed like knives against his awareness. But the metal answered. A collapsed support beam in a distant corridor twisted itself upright beneath falling rubble, saving a dozen lives without knowing why. A breached bulkhead sealed itself just enough to prevent decompression. Conveyor belts reversed suddenly, flinging inquisitorial incendiaries back toward their throwers. The world was not fighting. It was choosing. On the surface of the Forge world, firestorms turned alleyways into cremation trenches. Skitarii clashed with stormtroopers in cathedral factories, beams and bolts crossing in erratic, violent geometry. Blood sprayed across steel altars. Sacred runes cracked under boot heels. The black ships in orbit adjusted firing solutions, but could not lock. Something was interfering. The magnetic fields of the planet had shifted, ever so slightly. Enough. The Sisters of Silence reached the outer edge of the ritual sanctum. Their presence flattened sound. Walls groaned under the pressure of their blank auras. Inside, the chains shook violently. The Magos slammed his staff into the floor. Containment at all costs. he ordered. The suppression lattice flared. The chains burned. Magneto gritted his teeth. Memory surged. Wire fences. Shock batons. Men who called their rules divine. He refused. The metal in the chains did not snap. It sang. A deep planet-born resonance that drowned out the ritual chanting and made the walls shake visibly for the first time. In the lower manufactorums, surviving members of the Iron Creed gathered, not as soldiers, as witnesses. They placed their hands on walls, on floors, on beams. They felt the vibration. They bowed. The Skitarii faltered again, enough that an inquisitorial squad was cut down by crossfire they had expected to dominate, enough that the machines of war began to misfire in subtle, infuriating ways. Nothing spectacular, nothing impossible, just wrong enough to unsettle disciplined minds. The Black Ship's weapons systems began to desynchronize. Their machine spirits detected interference not from warp, but from something more profane. Alignment drift, polarity instability, purpose confusion. In the ritual chamber, the Sisters of Silence reached the final door. The chamber temperature dropped. The chains went cold. The null field sharpened. Magneto's awareness shrank again, painfully. The radical priest fell to his knees, blood leaking from his augmetic ports. "They are coming," he whispered. Magneto looked at the Magos, at the chains, at the walls, at the world. He had not come here to rule. He had not come here to conquer. Yet the world had begun to bend simply because he refused to kneel. The door began to deform under the sisters' presence. The chamber lights flickered. The Magos whispered a prayer that tasted like fear. And through the iron bones of Cyclothrat Prime, a terrible balance began to tilt, not toward chaos, not toward order, toward something that did not yet have a name. As bolter fire and plasma storms filled the Forge Cathedral corridors, and the Black Ship's cyclonic warheads reached final readiness, a single thought haunted every level of command. If metal itself was no longer choosing obedience, then who truly was losing control of this world? The God Machine woke without permission. Deep within the heart of Cyclothrat Prime, far below the manufactorum cathedrals and the screaming ritual halls, something older than most empires stirred in a sealed cradle of adamantium and bone metal. A Titan had slept there, not dormant, watching, waiting. Its mind, a cathedral of wet-wired cogitators and entombed human will, flickered from half-dream into awareness as tremors ran through the planet's magnetic spine. It felt the war above not as explosions, but as disharmony, irrational stresses moving through the sacred framework of its world. The princeps within the throne mechanicum gasped awake, lungs filling with stale, recycled air. "All systems," he whispered, though no one had commanded him to speak. The Titan's eyes, lenses the size of fortress towers, burned to life in the darkness of the vault. No orders came, no targeting solutions, just disturbance. Above, the war of faith and circuitry reached a fevered pitch. Bolter fire filled side chapels with fire and screams. Plasma incinerated logic choirs. The Sisters of Silence reached the last defensive ring of the ritual sanctum, their presence cracking the walls with nothing but emptiness. Within the chamber, Magneto felt the sudden awakening. Not as a thought, as a presence, vast, heavy, alive. The chains around him shuddered, their fractured link now glowing faintly, responding not to ritual, but to recognition. The Titan rose, its cradle locks released with a sound like the groaning of ancient mountains. Hydraulic pistons wider than roads extended, lifting the colossal frame from its resting altar. Servitor swarms flooded its exterior, desperately reconnecting data lines and incense fumes into vents meant to calm a temperamental god. The princeps looked through 1,000 linked senses. He saw fire. He saw men dying. He saw machine spirits fleeing into error. And then he felt it. A will that was not transmitting orders. A presence binding steel without command. "What is happening?" he whispered. In the ritual chamber, the magos felt the Titan's activation before any alarm sounded. Sacred asset awakening without clearance, a lesser priest reported. The words tasted like heresy. "No Titan moves without Mars," the magos said. "No Titan kneels to anomaly." Above ground, the Titan's vault hatches blew open. A cathedral-sized door was torn apart by pressurized steam and sheer mass as the god machine stepped into the open air. Each footfall drove seismic tremors through the planet's crust. Skitarii and stormtroopers alike turned in awe and fear. It did not raise a weapon. It turned its head toward the ritual sanctum. The princeps tried to seize control. He invoked the litanies of dominance, the binding prayers of Mars, the 1,000 coded commandments that had ruled such machines since the Great Crusade. The Titan ignored him. The machine spirit within it leaned, not under command, under recognition. Inside the ritual chamber, the Sisters of Silence reached the threshold. The door buckled, its mechanical soul screaming under the weight of their null aura. The chains burned. The magos shouted binary prayers that fractured into distorted static. Magneto hovered, bleeding from countless surgical cuts, eyes burning with something far beyond anger. He reached out, not to command, to connect. The Titan felt that reach, a hand, not tugging, not pulling, a memory of iron before chains. The Titan's massive knee pistons hissed. The princeps screamed, "Do not!" The leg bent. Outside, in the midst of firestorm and confusion, the god machine lowered itself. Not in worship, not in surrender, in acknowledgement. The ground shattered under its weight as it knelt, its cathedral guns silent, its banners hanging still. Every warrior froze. Every priest felt their logic cores stumble. Every machine spirit went quiet. In orbit, the black ship's aiming spirit screamed in incomprehension as targeting arrays lost calibration entirely. A Titan had knelt. The Sisters of Silence broke through the door. The ritual chamber split open to their terrible emptiness. The air went dead. Sound vanished entirely. Even the sacred hum of mechanisms died in their presence. Magneto felt cold, real cold. The chains went dull and heavy. The world disappeared from his senses. The princeps inside the Titan reached out in panic. "What are you?" he whispered, no longer caring if he was heard. Magneto looked upward, though the ceiling was buried beneath kilometers of iron and war. "I am not your god," he answered softly. The Titan trembled, still kneeling. The sisters raised their null blades. The magos turned, torn between terror and forbidden awe. Outside, the war paused, not ended, holding its breath, because everyone from the lowest forge serf to the farthest inquisitorial bridge felt the truth of what had happened. This was not heresy, not rebellion. Something far older had been touched. The Titan did not rise. It waited. The question spread through metal and marrow alike, heavier than any bolter round. If a god machine could kneel without being commanded, then what did that make the one it had chosen to acknowledge? Silence fell harder than any bombardment. Inside the ritual chamber, where servitors had once sung of obedience and priests had woven fear into doctrine, there was no sound at all. The Sisters of Silence stood like living voids, their presence devouring thought, prayer, and the faint hum of machine spirits alike. Magneto felt alone, truly alone. The metal of Cyclothrat Prime, once a dim choir in the back of his mind, was cut off as cleanly as if a blade had severed every vein that connected him to the world. The chains around him no longer trembled with hesitant warmth. They were just chains again, cold, dead, unfeeling. The Titan remained kneeling. Outside, war paused like a wound, held open but not yet cut deeper. Even the inquisitorial gunners hesitated to fire upon a god machine that had broken its own story of obedience. Inside the Titan, the Princeps tasted fear as a physical thing. "What did you do to me?" he whispered to the empty air. There was no answer, only the awareness that the machine he commanded had chosen something else. Within the chamber, the lead Magos stepped forward, his voice stripped of its confident distortions. "This is the Emperor's will," he said. "You are observed. You are gauged. You are found wanting." Magneto lifted his head slowly. "I have lived under men who said the same," he replied. One of the sisters raised her blade. The air recoiled. The chamber began to crack, not from force, from absence. Reality does not like being emptied. Something deeper than metal stirred. The walls pulsed faintly, as if they resented being cut off from the will they had begun to sense. The floor grew warm beneath him, despite the null aura that should have killed all such resonance. The chains hummed, not loudly, not powerfully, but stubbornly. Magneto realized something. The world had not abandoned him. It was not gone. It was simply quieted. He did not need to command it. He needed to remember it. He closed his eyes. He did not reach outward. He reached inward. He remembered fences of wire, gates of rusted steel, shackles that had cut into his wrists as a child. Metal was never neutral. Metal remembered. So did the world. The chains warmed. The sisters took one step forward. The floor answered, not with sound, with will. The black stone beneath the dais began to resist the null field. Its ancient composition, forged to withstand the horrors of the warp, pushed back against the emptiness. The Magos froze. "That is impossible," he whispered. Deep within the Titan, the machine spirit stirred again, though it remained kneeling. It felt coherence returning, not to its systems, to its purpose. A god behemoth could not pray, but it could recognize. Above the world, the black ship's cyclonic weapons spit corrupted targeting solutions into their command arrays. The magnetic field of Cyclothrat Prime was changing, not violently, decisively. Inside the chamber, one link of the chain softened, not broke, softened, became pliant. The sisters felt it. They stepped back for the first time. Their null auras wavered as blackstone and ancient iron beneath the chamber began to reassert themselves. "You are not warp-touched," the lead sister said, her voice a rare crack in the void. "You are something else." Magneto opened his eyes. "Yes," he said. He did not tear free. He did not explode his bonds. He simply let the truth settle into the metal. He was not trying to control iron. He was reminding it of itself. Across the planet, the Iron Creed felt it without understanding the reason. Workers paused, placing bloodied hands on warm steel. Skitarii felt stability return to their frames. Servitors resumed function, but with a subtle difference. They no longer felt like instruments. They felt like participants. The Titan shifted slightly, not rising, not retreating, awaiting. The Princeps felt his terror fade into something more dangerous, curiosity. Within the chamber, the chains no longer fought him. They lay, still wrapped around him, still binding, but listening. The Magos stepped back another pace. unable to reconcile the logic. The sisters lowered their blades a fraction. No order was given. They simply felt no need. Above, the void scar bled dim light across the stars, as if observing something it could not name. Cyclonic warheads remained primed, but no one pressed the final sigil. The war outside did not end, but it paused, because the world itself had shifted from fear to awareness, because the metal beneath their feet had chosen to live, and in the center of a ritual chamber that had been built to silence gods and flay heretics, a man in chains proved what neither Mars nor Terra had prepared for. Sometimes, iron does not bow to will. It awakens to it, and as the chains rested, warm and obedient without breaking, a terrible new possibility began to dawn across the stars. If he ever chose not to be gentle, could the Imperium stop him at all? The first sign was not light, it was pressure. Across Cyclothrat Prime, a weight descended that had nothing to do with gravity and everything to do with being noticed. The machine spirits went quiet, not in fear, but in instinct. Even the inquisitorial cogitators aboard the black ships froze for a fraction of a second, as if some greater hand had briefly rested upon them. Something was looking. Inside the ritual chamber, the air grew thin. The Sisters of Silence felt their blankness strain against an older, colder presence that did not exist in the same way they did. The Magos lowered his staff without realizing he had done so. Magneto felt it immediately, not through metal, not through magnetism, but through memory. He remembered what it felt like to be seen by something that did not care for suffering, only for purpose. Not as a god, not as a father, but as a force that decided what mattered and discarded everything else. The chains around him tightened slightly, not by mechanism, by acknowledgement. Far away, across a galaxy ground to blood and ash, a corpse on a throne of gold stirred, not in flesh, in will. Terra's lighthouse flared. The Astronomicon surged, and for a fraction of a heartbeat the warp recoiled from a thought that was not thought, a command that was not spoken. On Cyclothrat Prime, that thought arrived as a cold wind that had never touched air. The Emperor's gaze did not manifest as words. He did not speak. He simply examined. The Titan trembled where it knelt. Its machine spirit felt it like the presence of a master long forgotten yet never truly gone. The Princeps wept silently, not from fear, but from proximity to something that dwarfed even his god-machine scale. Inside the black ships, inquisitorial commanders felt their certainty turn to ice. None received orders. None received reassurance. They were simply aware. Inside the chamber, Magneto looked upward, not because he saw something, but because he felt where the weight originated, a consciousness vast beyond cruelty, beyond compassion, built not of love for mankind, but necessity. You are far from your world, the presence seemed to imply, without words, without sound. Magneto did not recoil. He had faced worse. I did not choose this, he thought back, though the thought felt like screaming into a star. The pressure deepened. In response, the metal beneath the chamber shifted, not against the gaze, but in fear of it. Old machine spirits coiled tight, making themselves smaller, quieter, more obedient. The Sisters of Silence dropped to one knee, not in worship, in survival. The Magos found his logic engine screaming paradox. The God Emperor was a symbol, a source of power, but this was not dogma. This was presence. The chains around Magneto grew colder, heavier, less willing. The living iron hesitated. Even it understood annihilation. Magneto inhaled slowly. His mind reached back to the foundations of who he was, a prisoner, a survivor, a man who had watched figures of absolute authority destroy lives because it was necessary. He felt something dangerous in himself, familiar, defiance. The gaze intensified. This thing on the throne had felt trillions die without remorse. It had burned entire species from existence. It had turned children into weapons and planets into tombs. Magneto did not hate it. He understood it. And that understanding was its own kind of challenge. The Titan's knee joints creaked, wanting to rise, to show dominance, to appease. But the machine spirit did not move. It remembered another will, a warmer one, closer. Above the world, the void scar glowed more brightly, though no ship dared approach it. Inside the black ships, cyclonic launch keys grew warm beneath waiting fingers. But no finger moved, because the pressure had shifted, because the judgment had arrived, and it was not theirs. The Emperor's unseen gaze lingered on Magneto, not as a father, not as a god, as an architect considering an unexpected variable. Chains raked coldly against metal around his wrists. Magneto lifted his chin, not in challenge, in recognition. I have seen what men become when they are ruled by fear, he thought, though he did not know if it could be heard. Your empire is built on it. The pressure responded, not anger, not denial, consideration. The living iron beneath the chamber softened just slightly again, reassured by the steadiness of his will even under something so vast. The sisters trembled where they knelt. The Magos tasted the metallic tang of terror for the first time in his existence. The Titan did not rise. It did not lower itself further. It endured, and then slowly, coldly, the pressure lifted, not gone, withdrawn. The Emperor did not retreat. He simply ceased to look. The chamber exhaled. Sound returned. Incense burned again. The chains warmed. Fear did not vanish. It transformed. Because the world had just been touched by something that could erase it from memory with a thought. And it had not. Above Cyclothrat Prime, the void grew quiet again. But in the minds of all who had felt it, a new terror took root. The anomaly was not beneath the Emperor's notice. It had been measured and left alive, which begged a question none of them dared speak aloud. What kind of being did the god Emperor of mankind find worth watching? The gaze withdrew, but the damage remained. Cyclothrat Prime trembled as though it had survived a divine hand resting upon its spine. The planet's magnetic core surged and recoiled in waves, and the old balance between machine obedience and mechanical will fractured beyond quiet repair. The war resumed without ceremony. Orbital fire lanced down from the black ships in measured, sanctified columns. Not cyclonic annihilation, not yet, but warning strikes meant to cripple, not erase. Defense batteries screamed as targeting arrays struggled to lock onto vessels that no longer existed where they should. The Titan stayed kneeling. Its machine spirit burned with silent conflict, caught between ancient programming and a new, unnameable allegiance. The princeps whispered prayers he had not spoken since childhood, but they brought no clarity. Inside the ritual chamber, the temperature spiked. The null fields collapsed in on themselves like dying stars, no longer reinforced by fear of the Emperor's direct attention. The Magos staggered as his data streams flooded with error. The world, destabilizing, he croaked. The Sisters of Silence rose slowly, their blankness tightening like drawn blades. They knew this moment. This was the line between containment and extermination. Magneto felt the pressure build, not from outside, from within. The living iron beneath the chamber surged awake, no longer hesitant, no longer fearful. The planet was not resisting now. It was panicking, and panic, in something this vast, meant devastation. The chains around his wrist blazed hot. The fractured link split, not with a snap, with a scream. The sound was not audible, but everyone felt it. The chains did not fall away. They dissolved. The metal remembered what it had once been, freed from its role. The chamber shuddered violently as conduit walls buckled and ceiling struts bent. The sisters took a sudden step back as the blackstone floor warped beneath their feet. The Magos fell to one knee. "Heresy," he whispered, but his voice held no hate, only awe. Magneto hovered free, not above the ground, above the law. He did not strike. He did not tear the room apart. He felt the world, fully, for the first time. The metal of Cyclothrat Prime rose to him like a tide. It did not beg. It did not bow. It reached. Orbital batteries twisted in their housings. Targeting rails skewed by degrees that rendered their calculations meaningless. Cathedral guns turned slowly away from the black ships without instruction. In the manufactorums, belts snapped and reformed, sealing ruptured halls. Great forge tiles lifted from floors, crushing invading stormtroopers in brutal metallic mercy. The Iron Creed did not cheer. They held on. The floor, the walls, the machines, and they survived. The black ships prepared cyclonic launch once more. Keys turned. Systems screamed. But the magnetic field surged violently, throwing their harmonics into disarray. Cyclonic warheads stalled in their cradles as ancient machine spirits balked at firing upon a world that had begun to think. Inside the Titan, the machine spirit made its choice. Hydraulic pistons screamed as the god machine slowly, impossibly rose. Not to fight, not to kneel, but to stand as something new. The princeps felt fear break apart inside him. Under it, something else bloomed. Hope. The Sisters of Silence lifted their blades once more. Not at Magneto, at the ceiling. The world above them was breaking. The forge spires cracked. Old alliances between logic and protocol fractured. The planet was no longer a temple. It was becoming a battlefield of identities. Magneto turned slowly. He felt the Titans rise. He felt the Sisters' intent. He felt the creaking of a civilization that had never known choice. He realized something then. If he did nothing, the world would tear itself apart under the strain of awakening too violently. If he did everything, he would become the tyrant he had spent a lifetime fighting. He chose neither. He spread his arms, and instead of breaking the world, he redirected it. The crashing magnetic storms bent inward, not outward. Orbiting metal debris gathered instead of scattering. Ruptured manufactorum strata twisted into new structures, bracing rather than collapsing. He did not command, he guided. The Titan stabilized. The Sisters lowered their blades. The Magos watched. And beneath everything, the old machine spirit of the planet realized something devastating. It was not being overthrown. It was being taught. Outside, the orbital weapons fell silent. Black ships hovered, unable to designate a target that no longer fit any classification they possessed. The void scar above the planet widened momentarily, then stabilized. The forge world did not fall. It changed. But change is never clean. Cathedrals collapsed. Ancient halls caved in. Generations of stored doctrine shattered along with physical structures. The world was still alive, but it was no longer whole. As ash fell like iron snow, and the war paused shakily between heartbeat and heartbeat, one terrible truth settled into the bones of Cyclothrat Prime. It had survived, at a cost, and now it must decide what kind of world it would become under the shadow of a man who had shattered its chains, without ever wearing a crown. In the cooling silence after structural collapse and redirected fury, a final, unanswered thought lingered across the broken spires. If he could save a Forge world from both Mars and Terra, what would he do when the rest of the galaxy came to take it back? The silence that followed was not peace. It was decision. Cyclothrap Prime turned once more through the void, no longer screaming, no longer trembling, but altered in a way that could not be undone by prayer or bombardment. Its skies still burned with rust-colored storms, its forges still bled fire and smoke, but beneath the iron skin, something new had taken root. Awareness. The black ships remained in orbit, their hulls dark and watchful. Their cyclonic warheads cooled slowly, their machine spirits uneasy, unable to reconcile what they had witnessed with any doctrine ever written. They had not destroyed the world, and now they did not know how. The Inquisitors stood in their bridge chapels, gazing down at a Forge world that had broken every rule without falling into warp taint or Xenos corruption. This world should not exist, one whispered. Another answered, and yet, it does. On the surface, the war ended without ceremony. Not with victory, with exhaustion. Stormtroopers withdrew from corridors that no longer behaved like corridors. Skitarii deactivated targeting protocols that no longer made sense. The Sisters of Silence departed the sanctums without looking back, their work unfinished, yet strangely unnecessary. The Titan stood, not as a weapon, not as a god, but as a sentinel, its massive form silhouetted against burning skies, banners torn and sensors glowing. It neither threatened orbit nor defended it. It simply remained, a monument to a choice that had not been approved. The Princeps sat within its cradle, hands trembling lightly on his control spires. It calls him, he murmured, not as a master, not as a god, as something familiar. Deep within the inner sanctums of the broken forges, Magneto hovered above a floor of smoothed, living steel. There were no chains now, no wards, no null fields clawing at his thoughts, only a planet that could hear him. The Mago stood at a distance, uncertain. "You have undone sacred law," he said. "I have undone compulsion," Magneto replied. He looked across the vast engine chambers, at the crumbling altars, the bent pistons, the half-collapsed logic shrines. Beyond them, through a break in the cathedral wall, he could see the manufactorum districts where workers moved freely between machines that no longer felt like masters. They did not worship him. They worked. They chose. The Iron Creed had no banners, no temples, no shouted prayers. Only hands on steel. Only quiet understanding. You could rule this world, the Mago said. They would follow. The Imperium would come. Mars would declare war. You could become a god of iron. Magneto thought of crowns, of thrones, of men who called themselves saviors and left graves in their wake. "I am not here to rule," he said. "I am here to stop the world from becoming what I escaped." Above the planet, the void scar shimmered faintly, a wound that would never fully close. Something still watched from far beyond stars and thrones. The Emperor remained silent. The Inquisition remained uncertain. Mars remained furious, but none moved, because none understood. Cyclothrap Prime began to rebuild itself, not according to sacred schematics, but according to necessity and choice. Collapsed spires were reshaped instead of restored. Broken altars were melted down and reforged into bridges and supports. The forges continued. Weapons were made. The galaxy was still a nightmare. But now the world chose what it became. The Titan turned slowly, servos whining softly, and lowered its massive head toward the inner sanctum, not kneeling, acknowledging. The princeps closed his eyes. I have never felt a machine. Breathe, he whispered. In the deepest strata of the planet, the old machine spirit rested. It no longer sang hymns of obedience. It pulsed, slow and steady, with something that might once have been called will. The black ships finally began to withdraw, not in retreat, in uncertainty. Data crypts were sealed, reports were filed, warnings were prepared and then deleted. They left behind nothing but silence and unanswered questions. From the far reaches of the Imperium, rumors began to spread. A forge world that no longer listened perfectly to Mars. A Titan that had knelt and then risen without orders. A man who walked among machines that treated him neither as god nor as slave. Legends grew in whispers. A world of living iron. A lord without a throne. A heresy that did not rot. Magneto stood alone at the highest spire of a broken cathedral, feeling the wind whip against his face, smelling oil, ash, and the faint, metallic scent of something newly born. He looked to the stars. He did not feel like a conqueror. He did not feel like a savior. He felt like a man who had refused to let another world build cages and call them holy. Behind him, the metal of Cyclothrat Prime shifted gently, as if breathing with him. The galaxy remained a place of endless war, rot, fire, and souls crushed beneath empires. But now, somewhere within it, a world existed that should not. A world that had tasted choice. And the final question lingered in the void, whispered across starless distances and into the minds of gods and monsters alike. If one man could give will to a world of iron, what would happen when the rest of the galaxy finally realized it could never be chained again?